All right, everyone. Our next speaker is Stephen Marsh, a Canadian novelist and essayist. He's the author of 6 books and has written for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Esquire, among many other publications. His most recent work, which is getting a fair bit of literary buzz, is a novella titled Death of an Author. It's very interesting because it's a collaboration between Stephen and 3 generative AI programs meant to sort of test the limits of creativity and perhaps push the boundaries of what we call original work now. Steve and I are going to talk about that collaboration with AI, what it may mean for the teaching of writing, and indeed the future of the humanities generally. He's got some good, strong views on this, and I really appreciate him being here today. Stephen, welcome to the Chronicle Festival.
Pleasure to be with you, Ian.
So I want to set the context for the conversation to start off with. Can you tell me a bit about your background and interest in generative AI tools as a writer? What kind of got you into this? Because I know you've been involved in this before what we may call this little boom, I guess we have once OpenAI came up with its latest tool or some of its newer tools.
Yeah, I used to have to beg editors to run this stuff, and they'd sit on it for years sometimes.
And now we're paying attention.
Now everyone's paying attention. I mean, it began really in 2012 when I wrote a piece for the LA Review of Books called Against the Digital Humanities. I've kind of gone from there to here. And then after I wrote that piece, some digital humanists started writing me some very interesting things like, maybe you're right, but have a look at this. And some of what they sent was very interesting. And then in 2017, for Wired, a computer scientist here in Toronto set up a system called Sci-Fi Q for me to write a science fiction story algorithmically. And that was 2017. And then I wrote one with MIT Tech Review, and then I wrote another one for the LA Review of Books. And then of course it's escalated into this novel with the transformer-based linguistic generative AI. Of course, this kind of the tools they went sort of from grade school t-ball to the New York Yankees very quickly, and I sort of was in the middle of that transition.
I appreciate the sports metaphor. Yeah, it seems to have picked up.
I stole it from Breaking Bad, so.
Well said. Yeah, it certainly has picked up very quickly. And certainly within academia, as you've certainly seen from our pages, as well as what you've been covering. I mean, it has been really upended many folks as we're looking to the future. I want to get into that in a second, but I do want to make sure people understand how you develop Death of an Author, to make sure it's sort of not a knee-jerk reaction of like, okay, you put some prompts in, it came back and he published it. No, it was a lot more refining and work than that. And again, as I mentioned, you use 3 different AI tools to develop this. So can you just talk a little bit about that process so we make sure we're coming to this again with the right context to understand how you see this as a tool for creativity and a tool for writing?
Well, we were trying to write a novel, and more than that, we were trying to write a thriller. It's very easy to get even very crude forms of AI to write lyric poetry or to write other things, but we wanted to write a kind of literature that has very specific demands, right? Because I'm sure, as everyone in this call is starting to figure out, ChatGPT can produce writing, but getting it to produce actual writing you might want to read is much more of a challenge, and certainly getting it to produce interesting writing is really challenging. So I've yet to find an artificial intelligence that can create good plots. I've used all of them for a long time, but I knew already from doing the pre-work in 2017 and so on that it was not a system built to analyze plots in a very effective way. So I had a plot, and I would put in the details into ChatGPT, tell it to write it in a very specific grammatical and syntactical structure. It would write that. I would take it into a program called Pseudo-Write, which has a button that says, customize this to make it sound like Ernest Hemingway or Chinese lyric poetry or whatever. And then I also use for very specific lines, I use Cohere, which is a Canadian large language model company, and I would create prompts there, and I would train it on specific examples to create individual lines, because I wanted there to be like there is in a really great Raymond Chandler novel. It chugs along and it's really muscular, and then suddenly there's it was a blonde, the kind of blonde to make a bishop kick a hole through a stained glass window. And so I wanted lines like that too, and I used Cohere to get them. So an elaborate technique. I would
Right.
say, and one that took me a while to develop. Like it certainly took me over a month to figure out how to get these machines to write in this way.
I appreciate your point about it being sort of a certain genre, trying to match that that tone and that style, and then also kind of bring something brand new to it. I do also want to note to folks, that the professor is a suspect in the murder as well as part of the plot as well, so people might find interest in that too. Um, you told the New York Times, "I'm the creator of this work 100%, but on the other hand, I didn't create the words." And
Yeah.
given how AI relies on large language models in many cases, it's built from pre-existing texts in the world. Can you call this an original work? And if so, why?
It is 100% an original work. It is as original as, I mean, I would say it's even more original than a photograph,
Hmm,
right? Like it is certainly, it involves my creativity, and no one could make it the way that it ends up except me. It is me using a technology to create an effect. But the effect is that sometimes the words are not mine. And that is where we're going. And
right.
that's why this is the most fascinating question in the world, right? Like that's why this is not just like, it is worth pointing out that the question of the distinction between um, understanding and production, and the distinction between authorship and created work, and these distinctions are entirely on the table in this technology, and they really, really matter. I think we, scholars, I was one. I was a Shakespeare professor in another life. Um, we actually kind of take these questions for granted, and they're really not very well understood. I mean, I think you can see from the public response to ChatGPT that people do not understand the nature of illusory language, right? I remember the first time I was a TA, my prof said to me, "Our only goal," it was introduction to whatever, it was Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. And he said, "Our only goal here is to convince people that characters are not real people, that you judge
Hmm,
like real people." And that's exactly what I've seen with this linguistic AI. It is in effect a sort of fourth dimensional character, if you will. Like it is in effect a literary illusion that people are absolutely taking as real. And I mean, that to me is one thing where it's like, yeah, the role of humanities actually has a really explicatory function with with this linguistic technology. Like it actually matters that you understand the distinction between meaningful and truthful statements, between what authorial intent is and what authorial production is, and questions that are perfectly, run-of-the-mill literary questions, but suddenly are very urgent in this technological moment.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Stephen. And I want to dive into the sort of the role of the humanities in this moment in just a minute, because I think that is
Yeah,
the really major place where we want to take this conversation, because I think you've made some interesting statements about that. I would point people to this December 2022 article that you wrote for The Atlantic called The College Essay is Dead, where I think you start
mm,
to dive into these things. And again, you make some big points here, but I kind of want to stay focused here just a bit, because there are some
sure.
faculty members who are struggling with this. Okay, I've taught the essay for years. This is really what is the basis for my course. And it has played a big role in sort of many um, fundamental courses in higher ed. Um, you know, if the AI has killed something, I'm not saying you haven't really advocated this, but you're basically saying, hey, this is the fact. Has something been lost? It's because it's not simply about teaching people to write. The goal is to teach people to think, and to think critically, and reflect on their own ideas. Is there
Mm.
something going to be lost if AI really has reduced us from this idea that the college essay, which is again something fundamental, I meant in higher ed, and for teaching something that is beyond just the teaching of writing?
Look, I mean, from the time I was 6 years old, I've been writing little essays that have been judged by teachers, and they thought I was good at them. And that's the basis of my whole
Right.
existence, right? Like I know how to, bring in and then have a nut at the end of the nut paragraph, the beginning of the second nut paragraph, arcs, like art, like that's how I make my living. It's how I've existed in the world since I was a child. And it is seriously probably dying, right? But I think there's also some, like, people are asking, like, what can we do? And it's like, well, it's already starting to happen. Like when I went to university, I just gave the keynote address at my alma mater, and I was thinking about, like, when I attended there, you could hand in handwritten papers, and like
Hmm.
you were judged on your handwriting, which was terrible for me. And also you were judged, you were literally considered not as literate if your spelling wasn't as good, and that went away too. And I don't think we lost much there. What we're going to see now is something quite natural, which is that you're going, like, perfected smooth argumentation and writing. The sort of, when I was a prof, that was like what got you to B plus. That's going to be hugely devalued just organically, because it can be machine generated. Similarly, I think, I've talked to some professor friends about this, and they were like, well, I'm still doing essays, but I have meetings with them, with the students beforehand, and they pay a lot of attention to those meetings now, right? And it's sort of, and I was like, this is sort of how the oral exam kind of creeps back in, right? Where it's like an essay where you're doing an oral exam and other things. I actually think the real crisis that's going to come for the humanities is when we find out that these are being used for dissertations, right? Because I mean, the temptation is going to be so strong. There's basically no legal way you can establish that something is generated by I mean, they have tools, but they do not stand the test of, they will not stand a legal test for proving whether something is AI generated. And that's going to be a massive challenge. I think something much more organic is going to happen with the undergraduate essay, which is that it's just the ability to write in that fluid, style where it is computational, is going to decrease, and you're going to want more fullness. I mean, one thing that's also very interesting that's happened is that already sounds like ChatGPT has become an insult, just generally, like not in academia, like in public.
In print,
and
yeah.
And what it has come to signify is perfectly smooth but empty, right? And that kind of writing, which, when I was banging through papers when I was a professor, if you were perfectly smooth and competent and empty, you were doing okay, right? Like, you were going to get that's going to be hugely devalued, not or organically, it seems to me. I don't know I don't have any administrative questions. It just seems to me that socially smooth, perfected writing is just going to become less and less valuable.
No, that's an interesting point. I want to kind of double down on this, just because, in part, because I was reading a piece that was published. We published just this week by Corey Robin, who's a professor of political science at Brooklyn College of the University of New York, a system that you taught in at one point many years ago. And Corey just writes about, becoming to this realization that he taught the essay for many years, and you feel like, oh, hold it, I'm really going to have to shift gears now to see the power of this thing. And he's going to do, as he says in the piece, at least, he's going to have more examinations, or you have more essay writing in class, not too different from the oral exam. But he writes here that academic writing has never simply been about producing good papers. It's about ordering one's world, taking the confusion that confronts us and turning into something intelligible, wresting coherence from chaos. And maybe some of this is me as a writer as well, right? This is like, it's not just about the smooth writing, it's those moments of self-reflection. And when you write that essay, when you look at your ideas, as Corey puts it, and sort of reflect on them and look back, like, okay, not only could these be better written, but these can be better conveyed. And that process, I come to something of an understanding about myself and my own ideas. I just get back to the idea, are we losing something there? Or do you think there's something going to be replacing it? Because I know you're not, again, not an advocate for throwing it out per se in terms of teaching critical thinking.
It's not like academic writing has the best reputation, right? It's not like, right? It's not like people are like, oh, let's all try to, let's see if we can reach and really attain academic writing. Like, that's not what people want, right? Like, I was talking to my son in high school about this, and he was like, you've been teaching us to write like machines for a long time. Now you're going to have to teach us how to write like human beings.
Yeah.
Now the machines can do it. You're going to have to teach us to write like human beings. And I'm not sure that is a loss. Like, I mean, there is a lot of formulaic, like, strategies that we give to students and say, do this. This is coherence. This is the system. This is what will make you comprehensible. There is now a machine that can do that so well. And, the thing is that ChatGPT, those moments of self-reflection, it can't really get to them. Like, it can, there are other AIs that are probably developed that are going to be more effective at that, but they're going to lose certainly amounts of reliability, huge amounts of reliability in the process of that. The feedback mechanism of ChatGPT is that it is super, like, if you ask it to write a letter of recommendation in an academic style, it is unbelievable how accurate it can do that. But that's because that's a boilerplate, right? And
Right.
so writing to templates just not going to be as valuable to anyone.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And to your point, that there's sort of a, I think Corey's looking at it from a very idealistic point of view of what we hope to attain. But at the same time, many students just do it for the rote, sort of, okay, I'm gonna hit these points, I'm gonna hit these things, these sort of the basics and checking the box, which has been true for many years.
Learning how to write with control stylistically to any template is hugely important skill. Like, I mean, that's not something that is, that I'm denigrating in any way.
Sure.
I'm like, but that is really going to have to shift focus. I think just because, you could, like, I mean, I asked it to write something the other day that was, it was something about Jewish writers in the post-war period, 2000, and it gave me, I mean, it was perfect. It was an A paper, right? And that just means that, like, that kind of paper is just going to be less valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you on that. I want to move away from the essay source specifically and get to this bigger picture thing that you make. And again, referencing this article in the Atlantic, again, I feel like it's a little bit prophetic since you wrote it in December 2022. Now we're really dealing with it. You write this line: humanists have greeted the technological revolutions of the past 50 years by committing soft suicide.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that, and how do you fix that? Because I think that we're in this moment now, as you've kind of pointed out, where you need to engage the humanists. Obviously, they need to be engaged in these things in order for us to navigate this moment and many moments going forward. It's not just a one moment in time, I imagine, with artificial intelligence or other technologies that are developed afterwards.
This one is, I mean, what I was talking really about there was the mistakes around Google Books and the fact that we don't have an accessible universal library, which really could have been the goal that we could have got to. But that, that is spilled milk under the bridge, as they say. This question of linguistic AI is the most fascinating question in the world. How is this machine meaningful? How does, as it access more language, does it move very slowly from meaninglessness to meaningful nonsense to accuracy? Why? I have interviewed the inventors of the transformer. I have talked to the lead engineer for Google's Palm, which was a 520 billion parameter. When you ask them why, how is this happening, their answer is, I mean, literally, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I talked to one guy who invented the transformer who said the correct word for what we do is alchemy. We are in AI where he said he compared it to chemistry in the 12th century, right? Like, it is intuitive. They are getting incredible effects. They don't understand them. They don't really know where to look to understand them. And this is about language, right? So the people who are going to understand this are the people who fuse technical information with really, and I mean, God bless the engineers. I've loved working with them. I mean, they are so great, but they read Lord of the Rings, right? Like the most of them, that's where it begins and ends, right? And you explain to them, like, oh, here's the concept of a two-dimensional versus a three-dimensional character. They're, how interesting. Like, there is a world of opportunity here. Like, I mean, Oxford University Press has their Shakespeare attribution model. I mean, just to take something close to my own heart, because I was a Shakespeare professor, but it uses word proximities and Markov chains. We have the greatest we have just been handed the greatest analytical tool since the concordance. And it is going to revolutionize our understanding of language and particularly of style. Like, I mean, one of the things I keep thinking when I use this is, like, they built this for weirdo people like me who really care about the distinctions in historical style between modes of literature. Like, that's what it's really good at. Everything else is kind of, and early models were doing that. GPT-3, I had a piece in the New Yorker where I had GPT-3 finish a Coleridge poem, finish Kubla Khan, and it was incredible. It was incredible what a good job it did. And so I would just say, and also, like, I'm a freelancer, like, I'm doing this on a laptop. Like, when actual resources are put into play to use this technology to get at critical literary understandings of things, it's going to be incredible. Like I mean, like I think it is going to be, well, anyway, I consider it, I mean, here's the thing. It's very rarely true that the most interesting question asked in an English department is the same thing as the most interesting question the world is asking, right? And that is where we are with linguistic generative AI. I mean, in my opinion. I guess I have been working on it for a long time, and I am quite obsessed, but you know, it's pretty easy to get obsessed with.
Yeah, I hear you as the framing as an invitation for humanists to perhaps engage with the world as it's happening in a way. It's an interesting way of framing it.
Look, all I can say is, I mean, everyone has their own fascinations, but it is fascinating. Like it is fascinating when you've studied Coleridge your whole life to have a machine finish one of his poems in a very effective way. Like that's when you see that, and then you go, and then I remember waking up in the middle of the night and being like, "What are the words right? Like are the words historically right?" And they are, right? And that was with 175 billion parameter machine. And then also when you go and talk to the engineers and the computer scientists, and they don't know why it happened, then you're in some, and you're dealing with really basic mysteries that seem to me like incredibly profound, but also just new. Like they're not like the old, they're like, I don't know what is going on, and so I don't, and no one can explain it to me, and so but something very powerful is happening, and so that's I mean to me it's the most interesting question in the world.
From lead to gold, like you said, alchemy. It's fascinating. I did not realize that. I do want to get to some questions here from the audience. And you mentioned sort of engaging
Sure.
with it. You've been engaged with it for a number of years now. Um, we have some folks in the commenting say, hey, I am curious. I'm nervous. I want to understand it. How do you, if you're a professor, and let's be specific here, professor within the humanities, perhaps an English professor,
Yeah.
what do you suggest to start experimenting with it? I mean, obviously picking it on the app and looking at it, putting in some prompts in, but is there anything more involved than just sort of playing with it that you would suggest for them to have a better understanding, perhaps of this text analysis, perhaps of these ways it can play a role deepening the scholarly work that you do?
I really don't know, and I mean, the problem is that there's no real institution doing this. Like what
Mhm.
you need, like I have access to this stuff because I was obsessed with it, and I was working with very early people. And I mean, honest to God, one of the reasons I work on this is that it was invented by people who live in my neighborhood, and my daughter liked to go to the dog park, and I met them at the dog park, and they gave me access to the tech, right? And they gave me, and I have really pretty, certainly for death of an author, I had unprecedented access to
Mhm.
the latest technology. Um, I don't know how they can do that. I genuinely don't. It requires some kind of institutional um, collision between a large humanities department and the people who are building this, either at OpenAI or Google or any of the other ones that have really high functioning um, artificial intelligence, large language models, and cross-pollination and experimentation. I mean, I don't know, like you can go and see ChatGPT and what it does, but I mean, ChatGPT actually kind of obscures as much about large language models as it reveals, right? Like
Interesting.
when you've used other ones, because the human feedback learning is so pronounced with ChatGPT, and I mean that is why it's so effective. Um, that's not the only approach to these large language, and certainly I don't think it'll be the model that's used by serious scholars when they're using it as an analytical tool. I think it'll be much more likely to be something like Cohere, but
Mhm.
I mean that's just my opinion too.
I appreciate that, Stephen. We had a question here that I think is on the minds of everyone in some sense about the use of it ethically. And here the question is from a reader is how can colleges best prepare and graduate students for an ethical use of AI, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level? You can take either pick, because I think there's a sort of slightly different question. You already mentioned sort of PhD, so I'm also curious about that. But just how do you prepare students for an ethical use of it?
I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask about making young people be ethical. But I don't. I think we. I mean, I think we should be pretty forgiving for a while. We
Hmm.
don't. I mean, I don't think the administrations don't really have a coherent plan, or they're back and forth. Or they're. I mean, like to me, what's probably best is to let nature take its course, in the sense that if you read something and it sounds vacuous and empty, but correct, hate it, because you should, right? Because that's not worth anything anymore. Someone who makes something that's vacuous and correct, but has no evidence of them thinking in it, worthless. Like that's, I mean, that's like clicking spell check and not having it and having correct spelling. It's not an achievement, right? So I mean, I think there's certain kind of organic things that are going to emerge, but you know, I think working out the actual systems of it, I don't really know, because for one thing, dealing with it administratively is a complete nightmare, right? Like you've got I do not envy the people who have to try and figure this out. You will not be able to prove that something has been AI generated. You will, like, and because of that, and also, people are using ChatGPT now, but they're going to develop other AIs that are going to be more sophisticated and better at doing undergraduate papers that students are going to access, and they'll be able to, and they'll figure it around. So, it's going to be very hard to have like any kind of I don't know what the correct word would be, like a corrective process to this. Extremely, extremely difficult, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate you laying that out, Stephen. It is very difficult, as we hear from professors who are trying to think about how to, as you said, not necessarily police it, but sort of think about it, talk to their students about it, at least have some guidelines about it. And some of those guidelines are coming from the administration. Sometimes they're classroom by classroom. So yeah, it's a little bit of a real unusual and confusing time for many professors. I do want to.
I mean, I think for master's students, like, originality will just be at a premium. That's what you will. I think it already was, right? Like, it's not acceptable just to write something correct when you're writing graduate papers, right? You want originality of thought and insight, and the AIs are very, very poor at that. Like, I mean, they can imitate it, but like, you can tell.
Well, Stephen, I really appreciate it. We have had a wide-ranging conversation. I kind of want to give you a chance to sum up here, and it kind of asked within the framework of how I've kind of proposed today in terms of a social contract between higher education and the public in general. But and ask it this way: what do scholars and professors? What is their obligation to society when it comes to the emergence of AI?
Well, I don't think there's necessarily an obligation. I think there's a huge opportunity. I mean, I believe, like, from the art that I'm making with it, which I think is the most exciting art. I'm about to publish an infinite story where it's just trained on prompts, and every time you open it, it creates a new version of the same story. There is a lot of green grass here. There's a lot of really exciting intellectual work to be done, and it is 100% requires exactly the kind of humanistic understanding that the humanities train you for, like, and so and also it's just, we're at the birth of a new medium. I understand why people are resistant to it, but on the other hand, it's pretty great. Like, I mean, I think it's glorious, and I think it's going to produce a lot of very new things. And I also think it's very rare to arrive at 2023 and be at the beginning of something. Like, usually you feel like you're at the end of something. But I feel like I'm like with the filmmakers making films in 1887, like, where they don't quite work yet, but maybe they're going to work in a couple of years. That's and I think that's just a glorious thing this is a glorious place to begin.
That's a great note to end on, Stephen. I really appreciate your time being here today.
Pleasure.
I've been talking with Stephen Marsh, who's the author of Death of an Author, and many other books as well. And I really appreciate him taking the time out to be here. I also want to make sure everyone knows that I mentioned that the essay he wrote for The Atlantic, as well as some other materials from Stephen, are available in the chat. We're going to be getting that out to everybody, and an email afterwards as well, so you don't have to grab them right now.